Welcome to the very first plenary session of the 2024 World Science Forum. I'm so glad you're here in this beautiful space here in the Academy of Arts. We are excited because this is the first session, and we are talking about something foundational: trust in science. My name is Sudip Parikh. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I'm also the executive publisher of the journal Science. I am excited because we're going to talk about trust. And, I'm the moderator of this session, and I was given advice a long time ago: when you are the moderator or when you're introducing something, you only have a brief amount of time, then you have an obligation. You have an obligation to be profound, because you're taking up time in front of a lot of smart people who are going to talk about important things. But my mentor said, no, Sudip, you're probably not going to be profound. So if you can't be profound, then your obligation is to be informative, because you have to give something important for people to chew on, for them to think about. But then she said, Sudip, if you can't be profound and you can't be informative, then for goodness sakes, be brief. And so this morning, I'm going to attempt to be brief and bring up the profound speakers that we have. So as I think about trust in science, trust is foundational to every relationship, whether that's a relationship between spouses, whether it's a relationship among families, and also whether it's a relationship between the scientific community and the communities in which we live. Trust is foundational. And one of the things that I've learned over time, and my wife taught me this, is that trust is gained in teaspoons and lost in buckets. When you lose trust, when you break trust, it takes a very long time to bring it back. And so as we think about where trust is in the community, between the community and scientists, in the case of the U.S., which I know best, the scientific community is still held in high esteem. The Pew Research Center does an annual survey in the United States. And until 2020, the profession with the highest trust was nursing. Nursing. Not doctors, for the physicians in the room. Not doctors, nurses. But scientists and the scientific community were a close second. Close to 80% confidence and trust in the scientific community. The COVID pandemic really played havoc with trust in science. And I think this happened around the world. That said, at its lowest point in the United States, trust in science and the overall population bottomed out at around 70%. 70%. So when you compare that to other professions, the legal community, the journalism community, politicians and faith leaders, much, much higher was science. So we need to think about the context of where we're starting, which is that science is still held in high esteem. But what's happened around the world is also a polarization of that trust. In the United States, by political party. And so we looked at the survey this year, and we do see a small rebound in that trust by about 3 or 4% from the bottom. So now up around 74%. But we see the highest gains in trust, again, coming from, in the parlance of the United States, Republicans. That's good, almost a 5% increase. We want to make sure that science is a bipartisan issue, a cross-spectrum issue, regardless of ideology. Science is an evidence-based mechanism. As we heard last night, science is a universal language that, when done well, can be an objective source of guidance for policymakers and, for that matter, at our kitchen tables, and can hopefully build trust amongst both the scientists that are producing it and the communities in which we live. Now, you've heard my brief statement about trust. Now we're going to bring the profound to the stage. And so I hope what we can do today is have a conversation about listening, about finding common ground, about being engaged and visible members of our communities, and importantly, about showing humility. Showing humility. The worst thing in the world that happens is when we show up as the only experts in a room. So we're gonna have that discussion today. The format of this session is that first we're gonna hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Tamara El-Zein, the Secretary General of the National Council for Scientific Research of Lebanon. And then we're gonna hear from our set of distinguished speakers. And then we're gonna follow that with a general discussion. And so to start us off, I'm gonna welcome Dr. Tamara El-Zein to the floor. Dr. El-Zein.
So good morning, everyone. So just to say that I feel flattered to give the keynote in presence of distinguished panelists. And thank you for the introduction. So allow me first to express my deep gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to give this keynote. But however, I don't know if you can see my slide. I will not hide the truth that my journey here was somehow very difficult. As I wrote this speech, I did so amidst the deafening sounds of Israeli bombings, surrounded by death and destruction, where thinking about science and its concerns seemed to me like an intellectual luxury. Yet, I made it to be here, not just because it's an honor to give this keynote, but because I carry an urgent message. Yes, we must restore our trust in science, but more importantly, we must renew our faith in science as a force for building knowledge for the good of humanity. As we all know, the decline in trust in science does not merely slow the progress of scientific knowledge, which is desperately needed to address the world's most devastating challenges. It also obstructs our capacity to engage in positive and meaningful dialogue about the solutions that science can offer. Yet, around the world, we see not only a decline in this trust, but a growing belief that science does more harm than good. Of course, there are many reasons behind this loss of trust. Among them, we can mention citizen scientific illiteracy, the very small number of science journalists, and the negligible space given to science and scientists in the media. To this, we must add the spread of scientific misinformation, which is more easily disseminated through social media. At the heart of all this lie two key players, which are on the extremities of the process. The first one is the educational system, where the root of the problem is. And this system, which is meant to forge our initial connections with science, to this day falls short in preparing citizens who can truly grasp the scientific method and in turn place their trust in it. The second player is the global scientific system or global scientific community meant to produce knowledge through science, yet now complicit in the commodification of knowledge and the rampant quantophrenia of metrics. This has led to a vicious cycle of rankings and evaluations, one that not only stifles scientists, but also distances them from society, thereby undermining their broader societal mission to bring science closer to citizens. How can we, even partially, address these challenges? A few thoughts on how we might begin, and I will talk only about these two key players, the education system and the global scientific system. To tackle the failure of the education system, we must start by recognizing that usually we mistrust what we don't understand. To rebuild the trust in science, we should not expect citizens to become experts, but we must ensure they possess a foundational understanding of science. How can we achieve this? First, we need to reform curriculum. School curricula should place a greater emphasis on scientific methods, logic, and philosophy of science. Our interaction with science is not only shaped by what we know, but also by how we can judge facts rationally and methodically. This will also help preventing the spread of pseudoscience and misinformation. Second, we should break knowledge silos, and it is high time to end the compartmentalization of knowledge into isolated disciplines, as the French philosopher Edgar Morin often argues. Since the early stages of school, scientific knowledge is fragmented across different disciplines with no clear unifying elements, which hinders the development of a cohesive scientific culture. To foster scientific literacy and a culture of trust, we must encourage cross-disciplinary learning and integration, not merely the accumulation of fragmented knowledge. Third, we must give greater attention to the history of science, not as contributions of the different civilizations, but as a practical and philosophical evolution of the scientific edifice. As Karl Popper once said, science should not be viewed as a body of knowledge, but rather as a system of hypotheses. We need to cultivate a public perception that science is an ongoing process. The failure of any hypothesis should not lead to a loss of trust in science, but be embraced as an intrinsic condition for its advancement. Last but not least, we must reshape the narrative around scientific discoveries. In our schools and across the media, we need to move away from the romanticized image of the solitary genius achieving instant breakthrough. As Nobel laureate Duncan Haldane wisely remarked, you can't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to discover something extremely useful. It is essential to cultivate in the public's mind the understanding that scientific progress is the result of years of rigorous collaborative research, and that is limited by the tools available at the time. We must temper public expectations, moving away from the illusion of quick fixes and embrace a more realistic view of how scientific discovery unfolds. Let us now turn to the second key player, which is the global scientific system where knowledge is generated, and to consider the role of scientific institutions. But before doing so, I would like to pose a few simple yet fundamental questions that should guide our future actions. What is the true vocation of scientific research? What do our citizens expect from it? What responsibility do institutions and scientists have in shaping public perception and engaging in the broader societal and political debates? And ultimately, what is the nature of relationship between science and society? To address these questions, we must also examine the transformations that have led to the current model of science, which is increasingly shaped by market forces. I will consider a few examples just to show these transformations. As many thinkers, including Etienne Klein, have observed, the term progress has gradually been replaced by the term innovation. And this linguistic shift reflects a broader paradigm shift, one that is deeply intertwined with the economic transformations of recent decades. We have moved from an era in which science was expected to foster progress for humanity to one where its primary goal has become commercial. This shift has fundamentally changed the public's perception of science, which is now often viewed as a commodity rather than an intellectually inspired adventure. Furthermore, the bazaar of international rankings and the tyranny of metrics, as historian Jerry Miller aptly describes, has deepened the rift between scientists and society. The mantra, publish or perish, has reduced researchers to mere machines of publications. Even more troubling for scientists in the global south, including my own country, this became publish locally and perish globally, further isolating scientists from their own societies and fueling growing mistrust in science and scientists. A few years ago, we were told innovation or extinction, and now the focus has shifted to entrepreneurship, not to mention the struggle of research funding. As Lawrence Bush observes in Knowledge for Sale, the market-driven changes in higher education have turned the scholarly research into a competition based on metrics such as number of citations and the value of grants. Scholars have come to view themselves as economic agents rather than seekers of knowledge. These trends have, without any doubt, contributed to an increasing divide between scientists and the public. Throughout these developments, little attention has been paid to strengthening the relationship between science and society or encouraging scientists to actively engage in efforts to improve scientific literacy and bring science closer to the people. Institutions must resist the growing obsession with metrics, and scientists cannot afford to remain secluded within universities and research centers. As Bruno Latour reminds us, scientists have a responsibility to demonstrate the value of their research to society. One final reflection, now that my country is enduring an Israeli offensive in which the pinnacle of technology, including AI, is being wielded with devastating force, I can attest that the application of science for destruction is shaking our core convictions and fostering a growing hostility towards science and technology. This blind fascination with certain technologies, even when they bring death, is deeply unhealthy. It forces us to reconsider the glorification of science power at the expense of international norms and the humanist values. It is the humanity, our ethics, our wisdom, that must define the purpose of science. As Isaac Asimov once warned, the saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. Thus, by advocating for a science that upholds humanity's highest values, ideals, as a servant of the common good, guided by wisdom and empathy, we can restore faith in its potential and reclaim the promise of a brighter and more just future for all. Thank you.
Dr. Alzine, thank you. I promised that the profound would be joining the stage, and that was profound. I'm looking forward to the discussion around it. Now I'd like to invite the panelists to the stage. From here, the format changes a bit. What we'll do is we'll have short presentations. Please come on up to the stage. We'll have short presentations from each of the panelists, and then we'll engage in a discussion. Terrific. Thank you. So we're going to introduce individually, and then they'll present, and I'm going to remind our speakers to stay within 7 to 10 minutes to make sure that we have some time for discussion and then questions from the audience. To start, we're going to give the floor to Professor Kajita. He is a distinguished university professor at the University of Tokyo. He is the director of the Institute for Cosmic Ray Research at the University of Tokyo and was president of the Science Council of Japan, and he shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2015 for his role in discovering atmospheric neutrino oscillations. So please welcome Professor Kajita to the floor.
Thank you, and good morning. This morning, I want to talk about gaining trust in science. Actually, I'm a physicist, therefore it's very difficult for me to speak on this topic. But anyway, let's try. Well, in this talk, I will discuss these items. Now, first, views on trust in science regarding global issues. The issues facing humanity today, such as climate change, are formidable. Even more, 20 to 30 years from now, society may confront changes which far exceed predictions based on current knowledge. How to respond to climate change is a fitting example of indispensable collaboration based on the mutual trust among three parties: scientists who conduct scientific research and technological development, mass media that broadly communicates these activities to the public, and politicians. In general, scientists feel that the effects of climate change are becoming even more obvious. However, political moves to address this issue seem rather slow. Of course, politics must deal with complex day-to-day issues, but I anticipate that the various stakeholders, including scientists and politicians, need to work closely together based on trust. Without this, our planet will truly be in a critical situation. In order to respond quickly and appropriately to unpredictable changes, it is necessary to integrate various research across a wide range of scientific fields, including basic research. Though politicians and society may be slow to act, scientists themselves must honestly communicate their scientific results to the large body of stakeholders. It is the scientists that can recognize the occurrence of a problem which no one else is aware of. Therefore, it is the social responsibility of scientists to sound the alarm to society and issue a resounding call for action to address the problem. If scientists act with awareness of this responsibility, it may result in gaining trust in science. Now, I want to move on to the second topic, personal experience of trust in basic research. I consider basic science to possess two aspects. Basic science will expand the horizon of human knowledge, bringing a common intellectual property for all humankind. It brings us closer to the truth of things and a deep understanding of the natural world. In addition, basic science may eventually be utilized in people's daily lives. What is it for? Is a question often asked of important scientific achievements. In Japan, in a well-known episode, my mentor, Professor Koshiba, 2002 Nobel Prize winner, replied to such a question, and he said, neutrino research is completely useless. Well, this may be an extreme case, but it takes a long time for basic research to impact on the lives of many people. I also want to mention Super Kamiokande, which is a facility for neutrino research. Super Kamiokande has been in operation since 1996. I'm certain that this experiment has maintained the trust of stakeholders for many years. However, there was a very difficult time. In 2001, more than half of the photodetectors in Super Kamiokande were lost in an instant. I was afraid that we would lose the trust of the government, the public, and neighboring residents if we failed to give an honest explanation of what had happened. I knew that we needed to explain our understanding of the causes, including what we knew and what we did not know, and to communicate our thoughts properly. It was clear that we would start discussion for restoration and countermeasures for the accident only after the various stakeholders trusted us. I really felt the need at the time for trust in science. Now, I want to move on to the last item, society's expectation in science. What I'm always concerned about is that even in projects for basic research, in many cases, we are required to state the ripple effect on society. Moreover, scientists are under pressure to say something to help their scientific research project be approved. However, when the project is approved and the research started, since such things were not the purpose of the research in the first place, few results emerge and with negligible ripple effect on society. This may have a negative effect on trust in science or scientists. This situation may not be unique in Japan, but also may occur in other countries. Next, I want to talk about the time scale. Well, time spans are often very different between researchers and the general public. Excessive expectation of science may deteriorate trust in science in the long run. For example, in some research fields, such as medical science, I'm aware that there are excessive expectations for definite results or discoveries to be immediately converted into a practical use. But this cannot happen so quickly. I'm afraid that such high social expectations might negatively impact on our trust in science in the mid to long term. Finally, I want to mention another aspect. Sometimes it is also necessary for scientists to make efforts to communicate with the public to raise the necessary funds. As an example from Japan, National Museum of Nature and Science, which ran into financial difficulties last year, succeeded to raise many times of its target through the crowdfunding. I believe this was the result of the efforts by scientists in the museum to face the public and directly provide their explanations for gaining the trust of supporters. This episode provides that there is support from the public for research that is not immediately useful. Okay, in summary, I think that scientists need to be honest and communicate the reality of their research to society. And only through such behavior, I think scientists can gain trust in science. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kishita. I'm reminded when answering the question about what is the purpose of your science, being honest is certainly the right answer, and saying that neutrinos are useless is a perfectly acceptable answer. I'm reminded of Michael Faraday's answer when he was asked the question, what good are electrons? And he said, I don't know, but someday you're going to tax it. Thank you, Professor Kishita. A terrific presentation. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And now we're going to hear from our second speaker, Professor Herzog. Professor Lisa Herzog is the Dean and Faculty Member in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen. Her research is at the intersection of political philosophy and economic thought. I'm going to ask her to please join us. She's a member of the Global Young Academy and has experience at institutions across Europe. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start by inviting you all to think back for just 10 seconds when you started your PhD research or whatever research was the first project you engaged in. I venture the guess that most of you were really driven by idealism. You wanted to know, you were curious, you wanted to make a difference with your research, whether a difference in what we know or a difference in how we can address diseases, whatever. And most young scientists that I've ever met also enjoy talking about their research. They enjoy outreach, they enjoy collaborating with others, they want to do all the things that we know are good for science. And then they enter the academic system, and our keynote already mentioned some of the problems. They experience pressure, pressure, pressure. Publish, get into the rankings, get in money, all these things. So I'm a philosopher by training, and I could talk endlessly about the philosophy of trust, but I want to be rather practical today, because I think we all have an ethical responsibility as members of the academic community to help make the system different. My argument is this: we know a lot about what it takes to be trustworthy as scientists and scholars and to build trust in science. But we need to make more space for these things in the academic system. And I want to briefly talk about a few things that it would take to do that. The first is provide young people with training and support to build communities. There are natural communication talents, but a lot can be learned. And also, when it comes to trust, you need to learn what to do, but you also need to learn what not to do. For example, in research on science communication, you probably all have heard of the so-called deficit model, which is this idea that we, the scientists, know something and the public out there has a knowledge deficit, so we come along and fill the knowledge deficit. And this so-called deficit model has been shown in many studies not to work. That's not how you build trust in science. It's much more about listening, about building connection, about being humble, as our moderator said. We know these things. There are tons of studies about them. But the average PhD student in, say, biochemistry doesn't necessarily know this. And we need to provide these people with mentors, also for trust-building activities. And now comes a tiny advertisement slide, but I'll keep it very short. We did a project at the Global Young Academy a couple of years ago, where we tried to summarize a lot of the knowledge that is out there on how you build trust in science in short, accessible videos for all scientists, young or old, to understand what it takes, how you make the first steps into science communication, and also to collect best practices from scholars and scientists worldwide about how you can collaborate with the public to build trust. A second point, when it comes to building science, I think it's wrong to just see science on the one hand and society on the other, and not to think about this in a more ecosystem kind of way. In sociology of science, there's the term interactional expertise, and that's the idea that you can have expertise in a field where you're not a contributor. You wouldn't be able to contribute to neutrino research, for example. But you'd be able to understand what people there are doing, to ask the right questions, and to translate that kind of knowledge in a language that other people can understand. And that has traditionally been the role of science journalists. Unfortunately, in many countries, because of the changes in the media system, science journalism has been under pressure. There are new groups of science communication experts, sometimes working for universities, sometimes also freelancers. And I think as researchers, we need to collaborate with these groups because they have a lot to offer for us, and we have a lot to offer for them because they don't do the research, but they can help us communicate it better. But I want to draw this even broader. I want to think about this as a matter of, and that's now a bit of jargon, apologies, about the epistemic infrastructure of democracy. What do I mean by this? Infrastructure is clear. All societies need infrastructures. But for science to fulfill its function in society, we also need what in philosophy we would call epistemic infrastructures, the infrastructures for knowledge and knowledge communication. And it starts with schools, but it also has to do with the media, with the science policy interfaces that exist, the advisory structures, all these kinds of things. You can think of these as infrastructures for a democratic way of governing, in the sense that governing is done fact-based and objective and directed to the common good. Whether or not that's what the formal democracies of this world do these days, let's bracket that question for now, but that's what I mean here. Also, often it can help to collaborate with the local authorities, with figures of trust who are there anyway. It's not the lonely scientist and then out there society. Think about it more in terms of networks. And building on that, my third point is that trust is about relationships. And as our moderator also said at the beginning, it takes time to build and it's easy to destroy. But to really build trust, we need to build the personal relationships between different people in society. I think one of the most harmful factors for trust in science is if you have high socioeconomic inequality and science is perceived as that kind of elite thing that is only accessible for certain people in society. And if you take that seriously, the question we as a scientific community need to ask ourselves, well, how accessible are we actually as the scientific system for different communities? What are the career paths that we have and how accessible are they for people from different backgrounds? When I was a young and totally clueless PhD student, I always envied the kids of professors very much because they knew how to play this game. And I'm not even from a very disadvantaged background. So how does it feel for people who are really coming from very far away to enter the academic system, and what are we doing as a community to help them, support them, mentor them, make sure that they can also be part of the scientific community and then build trust with their communities. And what is known is that this is a matter of long-term two-way communication, not just telling, but also listening. And here I want to point out one thing that has been very politicized in the Netherlands, where I currently work, in the last couple of years, but I think it's an issue in many countries, namely language. To build trust with people, it's often very helpful if you can speak their language. And as an international scientific system, of course, we need a lingua franca, but I think we need to ask ourselves how we find the right balance between globalized English and the local languages that people speak, and that we also need to talk with them about their problems, to also learn from them what they know, what they can bring to the table in terms of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and so on. And we need to find the right way of also honoring what people do in non-English publications, in non-English ways of communicating to society. And that's my last point then, actually. If we want scholars and scientists to do this, we also need to reward it, because the time spent on such activities is time not spent on other things. And to do that, we need a multidimensional picture of what it means to be a good citizen of the academic system. Is it only about rankings and papers, or is it also about these other things? But I also think we shouldn't expect people to do everything. We need the possibility of specializing more in fundamental research, more in teaching, more in outreach, but also shift the focus of people's careers over the course of the years, such that they can really do the things that they have the skills for, the interest in. And I think there's a lot to be said for thinking about scientific careers not as a matter of always trying to move further up in some kind of imagined international system, but to do different kind of things over the course of your life that all make a contribution to science. In the Netherlands, there is now a project to make the evaluation of research more multidimensional, with more dimensions of evaluation taking into account in hiring, in promotions and so on. I think that's a very good development. But we now have discussions, well, should we then measure everything? Should we make better rankings for who's the best teacher? Who's the best person in outreach? And I'm very skeptical about that, because that would mean that you get competition and you get a kind of instrumental competitive attitude in all these activities. And we've seen the harm it does to publishing. So is that really the model we should want for other dimensions of the activities of researchers? I tend to think that we should trust scientists more, that they want to do the right thing to build trust. If we try to micromanage and control them all the time, that's not going to work very well. And the stakeholders, they are often very sensitive when they feel that someone's doing something with them only to further their own career. They are very sensitive to more instrumental ways of approaching them. That's not going to lead to trust. If the system doesn't trust the researchers, it's much more difficult for the researchers to trust or to build trust with external groups. And finally, I think this is something that we all at least say when it comes to research, but we should also think about this when it comes to outreach and building trust and doing transdisciplinary projects and so on. It will not always work. There are lots of risk factors. And these longer-term projects, they are much riskier than lots of little pieces of research that you could do just in your lab or at your desk. So we should also allow ourselves the freedom to fail in these efforts, because only if we do that will we discover what are new and innovative ways of doing it. If it hasn't worked, it doesn't mean it was a bad idea. There might have been other circumstances that undermined it. Maybe we just need to, fail again, fail better. And for that, we need to trust each other so that we can build trust with society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Herzog, and thanks for your emphasis on building relationships, and also I heard some common themes about the tyranny of evaluation that I think we can come back to. Now we're going to hear from our third speaker, Professor Reyes. Elisa Reyes is a professor of political sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and she's also the chair of the Interdisciplinary Research Network for the Study of Society Inequality, and also a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences and the World Academy of Sciences. So Professor Reyes, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I think I would like to start highlighting the dual role that scientists play. We are members of the global borderless scientific community, but we are also citizens of specific contexts. Contexts that shape our vision, affect the way we speak. Like here, for example, I think we agree on most of the things we are saying, all of us, but we use different words, different lenses, because we are shaped by economic, social, cultural, and political factors. Navigating this dual citizenship to secure trust in science requires, of course, a common set of principles, but it also depends on strong institutions and collective processes that can respond to contextual factors. Let me emphasize the universal principle that science must uphold to earn public trust. That is social relevance, responsible social relevance. To be socially relevant and to make knowledge production a public good, science must adhere to the value of justice. In other words, it must address collective needs and aspirations, not just the interests of specific groups or the pursuit of knowledge without social responsibility. This principle is at the core of science as a global community. However, when we consider institutional and procedural aspects, trust in science becomes directly influenced by local contexts. Institutions and processes are essential because individual scientists, despite their intentions, can do little to foster trust in science beyond educating new generations. Unfortunately, personal dedication is not enough. And I think of institutions as a set of principles and norms that are repetitive and valued, so they become common sense. And institutions are not just bureaucracies. They must be a political arena to enforce constructive polemics, to create room for renewal of leadership and social inclusion. This solid institute is really necessary. However, we know that in most of the global south, capacity building is often hampered by resource limitations and political instability, which forces scientists to restart their efforts repeatedly, hindering long-term institutionalization. To expand public trust in science globally, we need the concerted effort of the scientific community with strengthened research networks and active science diplomacy to support weaker national scientific systems. I like to reflect on the experience of COVID because I think it highlights both positive and negative effects it had on trust in science. To start with the positive sides, which are often neglected. I think where there was capacity, sustained capacity building, science could respond quickly with new vaccines, and that was a factor that in many contexts contributes, even if temporarily, to increase the trust in science. From my own experience in Brazil, we don't have that much persistent capacity building, but there was a long-term established tradition in vaccination campaigns because the medical community had been committed to that since the late 1940s or early 1950s. So in that context, despite the strong official political opposition to vaccines, there was relative success in vaccination because people were used to do it. They trusted the medical science. So I even published an article on politics against science that show how science could respond to the challenge. And I think in other contexts, I have checked the available surveys. During COVID, there was a relative increase of trust in science, not only in my own country. But there was also a very negative effect. We know that. I mean, this negative effect was not just the result of circumstantial things. It was built on long-term political and ideological trends to use distrust in science as a means to advance other sorts of purposes. So, in a way, I think that weighting these two sides, positive and negative impact of COVID, teaches us how to reflect about our great need to increase confidence in science. I think it's necessary a continuous effort to increase capacity, persistent policies to engage the public, and strong interdisciplinary collaboration. Of course, this approach is not meant to dissolve disciplinary boundaries, but to foster a deeper dialogue that addresses complex existential risks we face. I mean, thinking of these existential risks, we see that, of course, hard science are necessary, but to reach people, we need to use the knowledge already produced by social sciences, by psychology, by all the so-called soft science, because that's the way to reach the public. It's essential to recognize that obstacles to public trust in science are not equally distributed in the world. as I said, in what we now refer as global south, these resources are critically scarce, and social trust, not only in science, but also in other people, in other institutions, is very limited. I found it very interesting that in Scandinavian countries, they refer to social trust as the golden of Scandinavia. The gold, because that's what creates the cement for solidarity. But as members of this borderless scientific community, we share a commitment to the social value of science. By working towards justice together, we can strengthen our ability to build public trust. Institutions like the World Science Forum is a great opportunity for us to interact as people from both the particular countries we belong to and to the community of science. Of course, when we think of what to do, it's easier to socialize people who are not socialized yet. That's why education is so important. But socialization through education takes a long time. Of course, we cannot neglect it. We must think of inspiring curiosity in children, but how to do with the grown-ups, with people who are already deeply socialized, people who are not prone to change their ideas. I think that this distrust in politics, as I said, often comes from an idea that science and ideology, or science and religion, or science and political ideology are the same. That's something we must really fight against. We have to show what is specific to scientific knowledge, that we are not competing with other forms of knowledge for absolute truth. What we must convey is the idea that our source of credibility is evidence, is the ability to recognize that what we know today is meant to be superseded by further knowledge tomorrow. I always like to recall Max Weber when he referred to the eternal usefulness of science. Yes, science has, the only thing true about science, it is the fact that it's meant to be superseded by new discoveries. Discoveries that are not absolute, as I said, but there are something that has social relevance. This idea of showing responsible social relevance, I think it's the crux to reach people and to foster a strong solidarity around science and around the values of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reyes, and thank you for reminding us of the social sciences at this table and the value of the expertise in those fields in building trust. Now we're going to turn to our last speaker, Professor Lepton. Maria Lepton is the president of the European Research Council, a position that she's held since 2021. Oops, I have to turn my page. Prior to her current position, she served as director of EMBO and established a research group in Heidelberg at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory that was focused on the mechanics of shape determination during development. Dr. Lepton, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So many important things have been said, some of which are also on my talk, so I've tried to, while listening, shorten it a bit. Thank you for inviting me here today. As we heard, there's data on public trust in science. Surveys consistently show how high trust in science is across many countries, even following the pandemic. The Edelman Trust Survey has been carried out every year, and trust in scientists is as Sudip said, typically higher than for other groups in society, especially politicians and journalists. And the 2024 report found that scientists are still trusted. So I think that's a good starting point. But we've also heard trust can be lost quickly as we know. It's often built on emotional reactions rather than deep understanding, and media coverage often shapes public trust in science. So scientists therefore need to be aware of how our work is being portrayed in the media. Some argue that scientists, by their expertise, occupy a privileged position in advising society. I think, and we've seen, that this approach can backfire. While expertise is of course vital, framing scientists as unassailable authorities risks alienating the public. That's why I think it's important to distinguish between the scientific method and the body of knowledge acquired by that method. So science is obviously not a fixed body of facts, and you've just related to that, but a process of inquiry, skepticism, and testing. Uncertainty in science is not a weakness, but a strength. It enables growth, adaptation, and self-correction. Science, in fact, thrives on scrutiny and debate. Fostering public understanding and open disclosure is therefore likely to be a better response to skepticism than asserting expertise alone. Public trust does not solely erode because of false information, but also due to the failure to explain scientific methods and findings effectively. And we've heard about the need to train that understanding early. And efforts to suppress misinformation may backfire if perceived as elitist gatekeeping. I'll leave it about the pandemic. I believe that trust is earned when scientists show their work and explain their reasoning openly. Public trust is likely to be damaged when scientific claims are perceived as shifting or overly speculative. We must be clear about what we do and what we do not know. So, classic example, when Einstein proposed, which I think is very valid to understand and to use in explaining this, when Einstein proposed his general theory of relativity in 1915, he himself insisted that his equations must be verified by empirical observation. And he himself devised 3 specific tests about how the way light had to behave. And there were expeditions that went out and used solar eclipses to measure the bending of light, which ended up confirming 2 of his postulates. But the third one wasn't proven. And he, once again, he said, they proved 2, that's great. Third one's probably right. No, he himself wanted that final test and said, my theory isn't proven until we have that test, in this case, the redshift too. And that was not proved until several years later at the Mount Wilson Observatory in 1923. So it was only then that he was satisfied about the likely veracity of the theory of relativity. That behavior at the time made a lasting impression, in particular on the young philosopher Karl Popper and his friends at Vienna, who said, it was a great experience for us and one which had a lasting influence on my intellectual development, and we must hope on our training in science philosophy. What impressed me most, he wrote later, was Einstein's own clear statement that he would regard his theory as untenable if it should fail in certain tests. Here was an attitude utterly different from the dogmatism of Marx, Freud, Adler, and even more so of their followers. Einstein was looking for crucial experiments whose agreement with his predictions would by no means establish his theory, while a disagreement, as he was first to stress, would show his theory to be untenable. This I felt, was the true scientific method. And that is, of course, what philosophers of science still learn and maintain today. So I think this example shows that we should focus on process, not on appealing to authority. Science should not be a set of unquestioned facts, but a demonstrated method for understanding the world. Science is humanity's most reliable tool for understanding the universe and for addressing complex challenges, from pandemics to climate change. Trust in science grows when it is presented as a method that embraces uncertainty, again, as we've heard, and adapts with new evidence, and not as a set of inflexible rules. Scientists and institutions should aim to educate and engage rather than simply assert their authority, ensuring that trust is grounded in shared understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lupton, and thank you for reminding us of the incredible strength of uncertainty. And I think it's a topic that I want to dive a little deeper into. So now we're going to switch to a conversation, and then hopefully some questions from everyone. I want to thank Tamara for your really compelling keynote speech. You raised several great points, which I want to come back to. I want to start, though, by building on this, this question of the strength of uncertainty. The scientific progress is not always straightforward. We know it's not. It is not a source of unassailable truth. It is a work in progress. And there are times when scientific consensus changes, new information arises, evidence becomes available, as Maria just described. This process is seen by many for the first time in quick motion during COVID. Most of the time, when people learn science, they learn it from a textbook and they read it as facts. But they saw the process unvarnished during COVID, and that led to doubt and, in some cases, distrust. I'm curious, in your own experience, how do you communicate the scientific process more clearly? You talked about the idea that we need to teach this better. How do we communicate that process more clearly to rebuild and strengthen trust in science?
So it's working. Thank you for the question. Yes, as you said, we all know as scientists that science is not linear. It's not a linear process. And we saw it in the past in different cases. If you take, for example, the work of Kahn and Sham, when they calculated the structure of electron, they did it on the basis of previous hypotheses, and it worked. But if you take the case of Watson and Crick, when they elaborated the new structure of DNA, they made the previous model completely obsolete. So you have both cases. So when we communicate science, we have to keep in mind also that it might take us in different directions. And this was the main problem during COVID. So when we communicate science, we have, as you said also in your introduction, we have to do it with humility, that also as scientists we learn. And the biggest problem during COVID, I think, was the arrogance with which scientists were communicating science. First of all, they are not all experts. So we saw that if you have a PhD, you're not expert in all fields. And especially when you have complex challenges like COVID, like climate change or whatever, you need really a cross-disciplinary expertise to be expert. So I think besides of the scientific illiteracy of citizens, the problem of media, I witnessed in Lebanon, we had 3 or 4 or 5 cases in which we saw really the problem of communicating science. First one during COVID. Few months before, it was the financial crisis, 2019. Then we had the Beirut port explosion in 2020. And now we have another war also affecting the environment, the economy, the population. So in each of these cases, we had different scientists communicating with people. So one of the problems we were witnessing is that these scientists, when they are on different TVs, they were transforming their speech according to the ideology of the media. So this is also very important that scientists often they should put their ideology besides when communicating facts. And the problem with these false, I call them false experts, that they were paternalistic, very paternalistic. And this is also another problem that when we are talking about science, which is an ongoing process, it should be more participatory. I mean, when you have new challenges like the COVID, for example, we should talk to people like, okay, we are working together to deal with this problem. Not, the case of COVID also was a political problem because of all the measures taken by the political authorities worldwide. So that's why also we had this kind of reaction. But as it was said also, we had a rise in trust in science in some cases, but mistrust in scientists. This is the difference because of the bad communications coming from scientists. For sure, we say always that scientists should communicate, but for that also we need tools. Not everybody is ready to communicate. You need to popularize science, and you need, as I said, to do it with the humility. And we need to put also in our minds that facing us, we don't have experts, we have citizens that should know and that they need to know so that the solutions we are offering should be acceptable by them.
Thank you, Tamara. It strikes me when you talk about this idea that we're facing a citizenry across the table that we have to respect. They're smart and they're in a different field, in a different area. I really appreciate that. Takaki, you're more of a basic scientist. And is there an opportunity in being able to show that basic science changes over time? We're going to learn so much from gravitational waves and other things. Is there an opportunity to create a baseline of understanding that science evolves?
Yeah, well, thank you. Actually, as a physicist, I agree with you. And this, well, first of all, scientific knowledge is not perfect. Even if we have a good model that describes various phenomena quite well, a new experimental result may tell us that we have to understand better beyond that model. Then I think we have to be careful on one thing. Well, maybe this is a particular problem in Japan, in Japanese media, but maybe let me tell. One thing we have to be careful is sometimes mass media reports that the previous model or theory was wrong when a big discovery was made. But in my opinion, at least in physics, in most cases, previous model or theory was not wrong, but was simply incomplete. The mass media may simply wanted to report to the society that there was a big discovery. But, well, I think we have to be honest. We should tell them the real value of the new results. So, well, I think we have to be honest, and that is very important for the trust in science.
Thank you, Takaki. Yeah, the honesty about a discovery is hard. We all face the need to want to show off. You know, scientists to a degree draws narcissism because we want to discover the world. Isn't that an interesting thing? Thank you. I'm going to turn to Professor Herzog on your reflections on this. You talked quite a bit about the need for experts and expertise in communication. We're not all good at it. Please.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for not every scientist at every moment in their research process going out, because as you also just mentioned, you can also do a lot of harm if you communicate things too early, if you're overly confident. This famous slogan during the Brexit campaign, people have had enough of expert. Anyone knows who this was actually directed to? This was against economists, because economists had predicted with 2 letters after the comma how exactly Brexit would affect the average household. And that was in a way overconfident. And the financial crisis a couple of years earlier had shown to people, look, you cannot predict a complex system such as the economy by these methods, and economists have often been too confident. But I think what we do need are people who are really good at it, who get some training, who understand the mechanisms, And I want to throw in one more distinction that hasn't been put on the table, which is urban and rural. In political science, urban and rural, for many countries, has become a big new category of different lifestyles, and science is often perceived as an urban phenomenon. The urban elites, I mean, universities tend to be in big cities and so on. And when I talked to a colleague from the US a couple of weeks ago, she mentioned a very nice example of how you can also build trust in other communities. And I think it was Wisconsin. There, the public university has local branches where farmers can put down samples from their soil and they can have them tested and discuss directly with the scientists. So the farmers bring their knowledge, the scientists bring their methods, and that's really long-term relations. And I think we need to be more creative to think about those kinds of networks and relationships and ongoing communication processes to really build respect and trust between different forms of expertise.
Thank you for that, Lisa. And yes, in the US, the Agricultural Extension Service, those scientists are some of the most trusted scientists in America because they live in those communities and they are a value add to the community. So I appreciate that. Your note about experts, it reminds me of a cartoon I saw recently of an airplane where the people in the airplane were saying, "We've had enough of these expert pilots." There's a tension there between the expertise and the credibility, and how do you build it without being gatekeepers? So thank you for that. Let me turn now to Elisa. You've spent time thinking about this. You talked about it in the Brazil context. I'd love to hear more.
I would like first to comment that this idea that we are scientists are elitists, but we compete badly with other elites. I mean, people trust politicians, the religious ministers, or even doctors. I mean, in my own experience, people who refuse vaccines would tell me, well, I follow science. My doctor told me I should not. So the idea of being a doctor is to be a scientist. I think the more unequal societies are, the more science tends to fare badly compared to other sources of authority. And the way to overcome this, to my perception, is that we have to show, as I try to convey, that what science does is different from any other sort of activity that inserts beliefs in people. We are not going for ultimate goals, ultimate values. I think that's where we failed. We have to find, simple ways to tell people what it is that makes science valuable. If we manage to overcome this gap, then we can make people allies. People say, if you are relevant, show me why my common life would benefit from science. And then we have to find ways to tell them that our value is precisely because we don't have absolute ends. That's because we're always pursuing to do better. That's my message.
Thank you, Lisa. Maria, so much of this comes to you. You are. I've gotten to know you, and you are a humble person. You're a great communicator. You lead an institution that, by definition, is one of the gatekeepers, the elite, that we talk about in those terms. How does an organization like the ERC, how is it able to do these things of communicating in a humble way and earning trust by showing that science changes over time? These are all things that are so hard for the ERC.
Well, I think we actually don't do it that way. And I want to return to what Lisa said, the engagement of the farmers. So I wish we could do more of this. Actually, we will in the future. We have a public engagement with Science Award, where we award grantees who have usually worked with the public. And so I'll give you one example of population geneticist in Spain who wanted to study the evolution of Drosophila flies to changes in drought throughout Spain. Now, if you want to do that, you have to collect flies over large areas over time. And even the ERC won't pay you enough graduate students to do that. So what the PI of this project did is she went out and trained children in schools to capture Drosophila, to recognize them and to distinguish males and females, which is fairly easy, and kids have better eyes than we do. So, and then, you know, collect them and get numbers, learn the values of statistics. And you know, that's brilliant. Guy in Holland who wanted to, who distributed apps to people's phones who wanted to participate, who would hold them up to the sky and would measure UV coming through. So that was an amazingly high resolution scoring of air quality throughout the Netherlands every day, much more than they could with the sensors that they'd installed. That teaches people. They learn from that what statistics and uncertainty is. Because if we tell people smoking kills you, they say, well, my grandmother's been smoking forever. She's 101 years, so you're wrong. They also know that their uncle did die of lung cancer. Yes. But, you know, but the frequency, the numbers, and the telling doesn't work. It's the participation that works. And I think, and it's the statistics that they have to learn, the likelihood as opposed to certainty, and which they do in these ways.
Thank you. Such a hard thing even for scientists to get probabilities, isn't it, and risk?
Yeah, and it's not everyone who can do that. So, you know, to say, I mean, the Wellcome Trust makes people, you know, you have to fill in how you deal with public engagement. But, you know, if you're kind of awkward and prefer to do equations on your blackboard or stare down your microscope and not even talk to your next door neighbor, then you're not good for that. But you're a brilliant scientist, yes, maybe. But so you can't expect everybody to do that. But those who are good at it, who have ideas, or where there are good structural ways of engaging with scientists, I think those are the opportunities.
Thank you. Yes, it takes all of us, doesn't it? It takes all of our different attributes. We can't all be great communicators. So I'm going to take the privilege of asking one more question and then having a discussion. A very quick answer, if you will. We've all talked about building relationships. I'm just curious, are there efforts that you know are underway, and again, brief answers please, of building relationships in your own regions and countries to build those relationships of strength and trust, either with faith leaders or leaders in the community or reporters? How does that work in your own regions? Tamara, let me turn to you again.
I think, as it was said, I think it's relevant to the scientific institutions to do some efforts. I will just tell you two anecdotes before explaining. The first one is about Peter Higgs. I was reading a paper in an interview. He was saying that he thinks he will not be hired by any university today because considered not enough productive. At the same day or second day, I was reading about a Spanish researcher, Rafael Luc, who used to publish one paper every 37 hours. He was one of the most cited researchers. So when his university sanctioned him because some of unethical practices, he said, it's okay, but my university will lose 300 places in the international rankings. So just giving these two examples to show to which extent also what is happening inside scientific institutions is leading to this mistrust in science. So as I said in my keynote, we need to have this shift also in our internal mechanisms of evaluation. At the level of my institution, I was appointed in July 2022. So the first amendment I did was to change the evaluation mechanism inside my institution. So public awareness, media campaigns, writing even in newspapers, it is now part of the evaluation process of our scientists. Besides, we also did many events to make science closer to society, but also to tell you that even inside the scientific community, between the different disciplines, there's a big problem. this compartmentalization of disciplines, even between social sciences and physical sciences, or inside physical sciences with medical sciences, all of them, each one is in its compartment. So first we need to open inside the scientific community, then also open to society, and for sure open with policymakers.
We have to trust ourselves before we can build trust with others.
Exactly.
Okay. Lisa, please.
Yeah, just tell you about one brief example, and I'm just one of many people involved in this. So Groningen is a university in the north of the Netherlands, and there's a network that's now growing about bringing together local businesses, local NGOs, local authorities, and researchers from the University of Applied Sciences and the research-based university on the topic of circular economy, because that's really an issue in the region. How can you make agriculture, local transport, building, and so on, how can you make all of this more sustainable? And this has so many dimensions. This is material science, this is social science, this is even research about how you build trust in new economic models. So the meta science you have on this. And so there's a couple of people really trying to bring these people together to learn from each other and to really go along with the social changes and understand what science can contribute and what can maybe then also be, learned from that process for science in general, but really in a very engaged way.
Thank you, Lisa. Elisa, are there things happening in Brazil?
I think I'm going to talk not about just Brazil,
Okay.
but a global initiative I am part
please.
of. I'm part of the International Panel on Social Progress. Originally, we started just with academics, and we published 3 volumes with Cambridge University Press on the progress and the setbacks of progress in the last 50 years. Now, on the second stage, we are changing the optics. We are working with NGOs, funding agencies, startups, to find out how the interaction between our different expertise can actually propose something constructive. It's risky because science is not activism, but we are finding ways to have solid evidence to become useful for the other actors. If we succeed, I think it's going to be a big advance.
Terrific, thank you. Maria, you mentioned the engagement activities of ERC. Are there sort of systemic things that are happening as well in terms of building relationships with outside groups?
That's not really the remit of the ERC. I do also think it helps to talk to journalists and allow them to get a better understanding of how science works. And the ERC has won award for that too, for bringing journalists closer to science. In fact, the winner of that award is right here, Fabio Torrone. And I myself use income from that I think is too much, where I'm paying too much for consultancy, to award such a prize to journalists who want to learn more, who want to get closer to science. So apply for those prizes, journalists, if you're here and feel you need more. So that's the other only thing we're doing.
That's wonderful. It gets to scale. Takaki, how about in Japan?
Well, actually, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I don't know any particular thing. Well, so, sorry.
That's all right, Takagi, it's okay. All right, I want to give, there's a few minutes remaining. I'd love to, if there are questions in the audience, and I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see. No, I don't, is there a microphone? Oh, good, there's a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this panel, talking about trust in science. My name is Rana Dajani. I'm a professor of molecular biology. I'm Palestinian, but I work in Jordan. My question to the panel is setting the stage for these 2 days. It's a practical issue. What is the role of scientists, academics, networks, and councils for holding Israel responsible for the atrocities that it's committing in Gaza, especially that they are proclaiming it, the leaders are proclaiming it deliberately what they're planning, which is a genocide. in building trust back, because the scientists and the research in Israel is being used to target Palestinians, as in the book by Anthony Lewestein, The Palestine Laboratory, and the targeting of academics. Over 110 have been killed. So similar to how Russia was held accountable for what happened from the scientific community, and South Africa, apartheid in the past, how can we build trust back in the global world that every life counts and that every life is equal and that everybody counts? Thank you.
Thank you. I will turn to the panel to see if there's someone who'd like to respond. It's a tough one for scientists. These are issues that are even bigger than the scientific enterprise. That said, I think the values that you noted of lives mattering, of lives being important, are incredibly important. The trust in the science for this panel, I think, is a challenge for us to speak to that at the level that you're talking. Next question, please.
I want to make a comment rather than a question. In fact, my own experience. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I used to write popular articles for the newspapers. And there was a time, as you know, during the Delta wave, then that we had no answer, that we were on a dead end. I used to walk around my house and talk to the common man on the street. What do you think is going to be the answer for this pandemic? Most people will remain quiet, and as understandably, but some people came out and said, answer will come from science. I think that was fantastic. And that made us keep the theme of the G20. I was coordinating the Science 20 component at that time as Science for Society. And I think I want to end by saying that for building trust in science, I support the comment made by Dr. Gajita that the scientists have to be honest in communicating to the common man. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. My name is Fabio Turone. I'm the science journalist who was just mentioned by Professor Leptin. I just wanted to add a couple of precisions, a couple of points, because I heard several speakers, the keynote speakers, mention the role of journalists. And I think that one important thing from the perspective of the community of science journalists worldwide, in the call that was launched by the ERC Science Journalism Initiative, is the accent on the independence of science journalists. Because we need to be put in the condition to represent the skepticism of society and to explore all aspects of scientific endeavor, including the gray areas that was so well mentioned. And so and I just provide the name of the initiative. The project is called Frontiers. So anyone willing to look into it, we will be happy to work together for developing this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps one last question.
Thank you to all speakers. My name is Aram Simonian, a Global Young Academy member from the American University of Armenia. As we know, trust has several dimensions, including trust in institutions, and oftentimes the trust in science can be built by scientists, but damaged by other people, like policymakers. So looking at the devastating photos from Lebanon, I have a question about how to involve policymakers as key and globally responsible stakeholders in building trust in science. Also, building cities, cultures, and human lives can take a long time, but ruining them, unfortunately, can be also quickly. So from this perspective, artificial intelligence and advancement in science is swift. I wonder how science can transform the education system to utilize its advancement for constructive rather than destructive purposes. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, perhaps one of us could address? Lisa?
No, I've also, in response to the previous question about political responsibility, I think it's a very fine line here between what responsibilities we all have as citizens and holding policymakers to account. I don't think it's specific to scientists, except in the area where policymakers really violate scientific values, there we really need to speak up as scientists. I think for many other things we need to speak up as human beings and as citizens of countries, and also address our own governments for whatever they are complicit in. And I think there has been a lot of damage done by the idea that science would be value-free. It's not value-free. It's based on a number of values that have to do with how you create knowledge, what you don't do as a scientist. You're not nepotistic, you don't forge the data, and so on. So science is a value-driven endeavor, but it's also not the same as the political values that we might hold as private citizens. And I think managing this balance is something that we need to have more conversations about, because we are all outraged at certain political events that are happening. But still, as scientists, if we want to speak with the authority of science, we refer to certain values that are specific, and we want to keep these values, which are, in my opinion, universal in scope, maybe somewhat separate from more specific political values. And I think we need to have more conversations on how these two roles are related, but we should not overburden science with something that only societies as a whole and responsible citizens who are acting together across all professional groups can do. But it's a bigger topic, so.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes, I have just a small comment, just to say that maybe the question is not to scientists, but it's more to these double standards in the scientific institutions and the global system. It's about double standards. It's the question by Dr. Dajani and then by our colleague from Armenia. I think when all of us, we condemn now unethical practices in publishing, in mill papers, in predatory journals, and so on. But when science is used to destroy in this way, nobody talks. I mean, I mentioned the destructive force now used in Lebanon. Just to talk, I'm not expert in AI, but from what I've been reading in newspapers, what is done in Gaza and in Lebanon with these triangulations using data of people, just if someone is suspicious, is in the circle of suspicion, the drone automatically will target him to kill him. So this is a big issue of science. We cannot say that as scientists we have nothing to do with it. No, it's an issue of science, because as I said also, trust in science is important, but faith in science as a force to build peace, to build the good for humanity is more important than trust in it as scientific process. So no, we have to say, we have to talk. I mean, and as a Lebanese, that's why I preferred if my colleagues, European colleagues, might answer, because as Lebanese, I'm living in it. So I know what I'm talking about. I show you some pictures. So I could take the plane, but I'm not sure I will be able to land again. So no, as a scientist, and I've been in EU a few months ago to talk about the principles of international cooperation and so on. Many of the speeches were talking about boycotting Russian scientists. Why in this case it's okay, it's not okay in the other case? Like in Olympics. So when we are in scientific institutions, at least to have one standard, not double standards. That's all what we ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you. Thank you. We are at the end of our time, and it's gone big red on me. But I do want to ask. I'm going to give you one thing, just one or two words, please. We've seen a discussion that has notes of optimism and notes of pessimism. We are living in challenging, uncertain times. I just want you to. I'd love to get just a sense from you in the conversations that we're having, the conversations you're having about trust in science, about the issues, Tamara, that you just raised. Are you feeling optimistic in terms of the trend line, or pessimistic in terms of the trend line, and how much work that's going to be for the world science community? So, Maria, I'll start with you. Please, very short.
I'm always an optimist, I have to be, but it's particularly hard at the moment.
Thank you. Elisa, please.
I follow here. I mean, as a scientist, especially a social science, I have no right to be pessimistic. So I think we have to bet on the possibilities and not on the non-possibilities. I think we still have the opportunity to make a difference, and we have to strive for it.
Okay, thank you. Tamara.
also, I'm very optimistic. Despite what's happening, you see I'm smiling, so I'm very optimistic. But I think, first of all, the responsibility is on the shoulders of scientists and scientific institutions, that changes should come from inside.
Thank you, Tamara. Lisa.
Thank you. I think lots of the challenges are not coming from only within the academic system. And so I think we need to pick up our responsibility as citizens to hold certain forces to account. And that will then also help to be more optimistic about trust in science.
Thank you. Takaki, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, certainly, in order to gain the trust in science, I think we have to work hard. But I want to be in the optimistic side.
Thank you all. Thank you all for the audience for wonderful questions.